convince my lovely colleagues over there hoarding the cheese to come this way. Hi. Thanks. Hi, Kat. Thank you so much for coming. It's wonderful to see you all here tonight. I'm Dan Rosenberg. I'm the director of the Visiting Writers Series, and as always, the first thing I want to make sure I do, lest I forget, is thank NYSCA, the New York State Council on the Arts, whose support allows us to bring wonderful writers like Leslie Jamison to campus. I'd also like, for this event, to thank Nick Kowalczyk at Ithaca College. He's my counterpart with their Distinguished Writers Series, and he and I worked together to bring Leslie up to this area for events at both schools, and so always happy when we can do that and make those connections. I'm going to do a brief intro for Leslie. She'll come up and read. We'll have time for questions at the end, and then her most recent book, The Recovering, Intoxication and Its Aftermath, is here for sale. I will be your bookseller this evening as well, and I'll remind you of that a little bit at the end. But Leslie Jamison. Yeah, that's it. That was good. You wish. No, you have to listen to me for one more minute. I'm sorry. This is my stall as people trickle in. Leslie has worked as a baker, an office temp, an innkeeper, a tutor, and a medical actor. Or as my other friend who did that job referred to it, medical pretending, where you just feign an illness and the doctors in training practice caring for you. Now she teaches at Columbia University's MFA program, where she directs the nonfiction concentration. And I wanted to sort of highlight the trajectory of Leslie's professional history, because I wanted to emphasize, particularly to our students, that a writer's success, or maybe anyone's success, doesn't happen linearly. There are detours and false starts, but those are as important as the victories in shaping who we are and who we think, or what we think is important to us as writers and as people. In her most recent book, The Recovering, Leslie talks explicitly about shifting ideas of what makes a good story. How in the world of recovery from alcoholism and substance abuse, the best stories aren't necessarily the most original ones, but the most familiar ones that can affirm. And she weaves together the stories of her own experiences with recovery with those of famous writers and other artists and other less famous people, and the attitude of the culture at large toward addiction, deciding who is sick and who is a criminal. It's a memoir, and it's journalism, and it's research, and it's reportage, all intertwined. And reading it, I felt like I was reading a beautiful portrait of someone who understands the human world through literature as much as through experience, and who therefore understands the human world through a lens of empathy. To be inside one of Leslie's stories is to be in the company of an honest mind at active work. It's a real pleasure, and I'm excited to experience it in person right now. So please join me in welcoming Leslie Jamison.
Thank you, Dan. That was such a lovely introduction. I'm also, it's always nice when an introduction includes some of my former jobs, because then it means that if my reading doesn't leave you guys with anything you want to ask me questions about, you can ask me about being an innkeeper and a baker and a medical pretender, which is what we should all call that job. But yes, I'm going to read a little bit, and I'll tell you a little bit about what I'm going to read. But really my favorite part of the evening is always the questions, because I've read my books already several times, and what really feels most alive to me is when I get to hear your responses and what you're wondering about, either from the passages that I read or more broadly about these the two books I'm going to read from, or as Dan was saying so beautifully, like the way that a kind of writing life often has many twists and turns and unexpected moments. So I'm happy to talk about that as well. And I should just say, always, I'm so curious always to know what you guys are wrestling with in your work or in your thinking about what writing can do. So feel free to bring those questions to me as well. So I'm going to read a little bit from this book, The Recovering, which Dan was describing so gracefully. And then I'm going to read a little bit from a book that I have coming out in September, which is a collection of essays called Make It Scream, Make It Burn. But I'm going to start, so as Dan mentioned, this book, The Recovering, has a number of different strands. There's personal narrative, there's reportage, other people's stories of addiction and recovery, and then I'm looking at a bunch of artists and writers who not only wrestled with addiction, but wrestled with addiction in their work. And I was particularly interested in this question of how or if the process of getting better could yield stories that were as compelling, as dynamic, as alive as the kind of process of falling apart. Because when I came of age as a writer, there was this kind of romantic quality to self-destruction, and it seemed like all these great writers had been drunkards and addicts and had been like killing themselves quickly or slowly in all these different ways, and there was something kind of magnetic about that darkness, and it seemed like that darkness was where beauty came from and where truth came from, and often it was. But as I started to get sober, tried to start getting sober, I was really interested in like how could you make art that was beautiful and dynamic from the kind of space and process of getting better? Was that possible? What would that look like? So I was in this book I document not only my own process of trying to get sober, but also look at other artists and writers to see how sobriety and recovery changed, what their work was like, and what they wanted their creative work to do. So those are some of the questions that I was wrestling with here. But the passage I thought I would read today is actually a passage I've never read before out loud. I mean, I've read it, but I haven't never read it out loud. And so the masterclass conversation that we were having earlier, in which people were bringing up a lot of really fascinating questions. One of the things we were talking about was like, what do you owe other people when you're writing about them? And this book includes quite a bit of narrative around a 4-year relationship that spanned essentially the last couple years of my drinking and the first couple years of my sobriety. And earlier today I was talking a little bit about the process of showing this manuscript while it was still in process to the person who was in that relationship with me, somebody named Dave, and going back and forth with him. I'm not in a relationship with him any longer, but he's a tremendous and very generous person, and he was willing to engage with me about the way that I was telling the story of our relationship in this book. And at one point, one of the things that he sort of pushed back against in this early draft that he read was the way in which he felt like the portrait of him was very one-sided, and it was a sort of one-sided portrait of our relationship that showed so much of our struggle and not very much of our bliss. And so he was sort of pushing me to honor the complexity of what we shared, to sort of show what we were connected to in each other, as well as what was kind of breaking down between us. And so ultimately that process of sort of letting him weigh in on the portrait of our relationship in the book, it ended up not making me feel censored or sort of straitjacketed, but actually it ended up making the book a more complicated, kind of multi-layered portrait, hopefully. So I thought I would read a couple pages that I wrote largely in response to some of his feedback on the book, trying to dig into that complexity that he was asking for. And the point at the narrative in which this section takes place is pretty early on in my sobriety, when I'm trying to figure out basically how to get through the day without drinking, and certainly how to be close to another person without drinking. At least there was this. When Dave and I sat down to eat our corn and tomato salads, this was taking place in Iowa, where probably 90% of what we ate was corn or tomatoes. When Dave and I sat down to eat our corn and tomato salads, I was no longer trying to hide the wild animal of need, no longer trying to keep from saying, let's drink another round, can we pour another glass? Now we drank sparkling water with lime. As a sobriety gift, Dave gave me an antique seltzer carbonator, a beautiful glass and wire contraption that could make soda from syrup, raspberry, ginger, vanilla. I loved him so much for that gift, for the way he was brightening the landscape of the great, dry forever of sobriety. We just had to get a little cartridge to carbonate the water. We were trying to launch ourselves back into the wonder of our relationship in its early months. On a bright, cold winter day, we drove in search of a place called the Maharishi Vedic City, a town founded by a guru in the middle of cornfields, where every building faced east and had a little golden spire on its roof. It even had its own currency, the Ram. Its transcendental meditation halls were called yogic flying chambers. I'd seen online videos of yogic flying, people bouncing across mats with their knees crossed. It looked awkward but joyful, and I wanted to believe that the flurry of their effort was a sign of transcendence rather than its absence. Dave and I drove through snowy cornfields and kept our eyes peeled for golden spires. What we found was a desolate dirt road, patchy with unplowed snow, and a building the color of sour cream where a vegan brunch was being served, lentils and curried cauliflower, where Dave wasn't even hungry since he'd eaten so much jerky on the road. But he ate anyway, because we were doing this together. He pointed out a small red fox trotting gracefully across the crusted snow, leaving a trail of delicate prints in its wake. We had no rum, but it turned out we could pay with a credit card. After brunch, full of lentils, we went looking for the yogic flying chambers. We nearly ran our car into several snowdrifts. We were trying so hard to have a good day. When we found the flying chambers, they were empty. We stood at the threshold and peered inside, where meditating bodies should have been, their knees flapping like bird wings. There was only silence, and a stillness so solitary it made me want to touch the man next to me, fox spotter, co-pilot, and so I did. I touched him, and then we left. Loving Dave was like this. It was his jeans against my tights when we kissed in our kitchen, my hands still soapy from the dishes, and the tornado siren wailing outside. It was eggs and coffee on our orange couch with mounds of snow outside our windows, domed over the cars, in drifts like hills over the park. As we shivered with gratitude for our home, this living room, this warmth. It was the way we delivered the world to each other, how he told me about cedar waxwings landing just down the block from our house in the middle of their migration, their breasts yellow like yolks stirred into milk, their little crested tufts like arrowheads. Loving Dave meant going to Gabe's, a club downtown that smelled like stale beer and other people's sweat, and watching a woman layer drum loops with her ukulele, listening to her alto voice full of gristle and yearning, sensing the hum of Dave's excitement beside me as this woman captured her chorus with her foot pedal and played it back with a difference. How excited he was by the sheer act of making. It meant hearing a teenage girl in the library talking to her friend. When Brian and I were going out, he would wall me like, "I like you so much, I don't even have words." And knowing I had found one with all the words, but I still felt walled. Loving him meant getting thrown onto our bed and tickled our fierce play, and then lying in bed for hours the next night, waiting for him to come home, picking his dark curls off the pillows to remind myself he slept here. This was our bed. It smelled like the smell that lived in the crook of his neck. Dave taught me a quote from Gertrude Stein, "Dirt is clean when there is a volume." And I wanted this to mean there was something on the other side of all our accumulated friction, how we clashed against each other and then came back to say, "It's you I want." When I watched him sleep, with one arm flung across his face, love ached through me so hard I had to ball the sheets in my fist. As an exercise in surrendering control, Dave asked his students to write collaborative poems. "When this happens," he wrote once, describing the assignment, "you can feel the boundary between self and other flicker, each an organ to some larger being." He gave me a poem he'd written about a flock of birds lifting off from the park across the street, as if touching the same being made them part of the same dream. Though I saw us living in binary, Dave wanted to be free, and I wanted to be certain. In truth, we were asking so many of the same questions. What it meant to let your edges dissolve, to be surprised, to touch some dream or being larger than yourself. And this next piece is, I'm going to read a whole essay, but it's a very short essay, pretty short essay. And it's kind of getting at some of the same ideas, but in a very different way. So it's about how to grant other people what I think of as the dignity of complexity on the page, which is like to say, when I write about somebody else, I don't owe them kind of perfection on the page, but I do owe them complexity. And in that case, I was writing about a relationship that I had lived very deeply inside of, and that poses one set of difficulties when you're trying to sort of summon something besides your sometimes reductive narratives about the people closest to you. But this essay is about an encounter with a stranger, and it's, in a way, transcribing the attempt to grant that stranger the dignity of complexity as well. And it is called Layover Story. This is the story of a layover. Who tells that story? I'm telling it to you now. One January evening, my flight got delayed out of Louisiana, where I'd been talking to people about their past lives, and I missed my connection in Houston. I had a night there. Trying to have a travel experience near the Houston airport is like trying to write a poem from the words on a yeast packet. Don't try to make it beautiful. Just let it rise. Let the freeways run like unspooled thread into the night. Blink against the neon signs of chain stores. Take shelter where you can. I take shelter at the Salmon Pink Hotel where I am sent. On our shuttle from the airport, I hear the voice of a difficult woman coming from the front row. She can't believe the bus will run only on the hour the next morning. She can't believe her dinner voucher is for so little money. She needs someone to take her bag into the lobby. She'll also need someone to fetch it tomorrow. Later, at the hotel restaurant, her voice is there again at the table behind me. She wants her bag placed where she can see it. She wants her water without ice. She doesn't want to be a pain, but she really needs to know if the veggie wrap is absolutely 100% vegetarian. She wants to know about the other stranded people sitting around us, especially Martin the German and the Penn State math major. The math major loves Pie Day. The woman with the voice wants to know if she bakes pie for Pie Day. No, she just eats pie for Pie Day. What kind of pie does she like? All kinds. What kind of math does she like? All kinds.
Well, okay, she especially likes patterns and sequences. The woman with the voice wants to know how she feels about I to the I. The undergrad doesn't know about I to the I. Oh, girlfriend, says the woman with the voice. Go look up I to the I. When she finally turns to me, the woman with the voice turns out to be a woman with curly black hair. She asks what I do for a living. She loves that I'm a writer. She tells me she wants to get into the interviewing business. Seems like she's already in it. Turns out she's coming from a vacation in Cabo. Turns out she's on my flight back to Newark. She suggests we protest the hourly shuttles together. The 4 a.m. departure is too early for our flight, but the 5 a.m. is too late. We should campaign for a 4:40 or a 4:45. She is a difficult woman from New York, trying to convince me that we should be difficult women from New York together. But I'm not a difficult woman from New York. I'm not any kind of person from New York. I just happen to live there. I just want to take the 4 a.m. shuttle and stop talking about it. It embarrasses me to be associated with her requests, with her sense of entitlement, with these justifications. I hurt more, I need more, but probably it's only because I recognize myself in them. It's only when the woman and I walk to the front desk to check on the shuttle that I notice how she walks. The woman with the voice is also a woman with a body. She's limping. Once I notice her limp, I feel guilty about leaving her to make the shuttle request alone, as if it would be an act of abandonment in her hour of need to refuse her my company. She tells the clerk she needs help with her bags, and in the morning she will need help again. She explains that she was in a wheelchair at the airport. I bet she has one of those nebulous pain conditions where the pain is always moving somewhere else. I bet she felt like a victim before she ever started hurting. I am actually thinking these things, and I am someone who has written indignantly about the world's tendency to minimize the pain of women in precisely these ways for precisely these reasons. We don't get our 4:40 shuttle. She's going to speak to a manager, she tells me. She'll call me when she gets this sorted out. She takes my number. We trade our names. Back in my room, I Google the name she's given me. It's fairly unusual and involves a body part. The first 10 hits are all the same porn star. The next hit is an article about a stabbing spree on the Upper West Side a year earlier. A homeless man lunged at 5 strangers with a pair of scissors. The face of the woman with the voice is one of the 5 faces. I enlarge her on my screen. I try to remember her limp, which part of her was hurting. 5 people, including a 2-year-old boy, were rushed to the hospital after a man went on a 9-minute rampage. I picture the woman with the voice, with scissors in her thigh or her knee or her foot, severing some nerve or vein and leaving her, a year later, still limping. When I see her in the morning, I won't tell her what I know. The etiquette of our era demands that we pretend we are still unknown to each other, when she will know I probably Googled her and I will know she probably Googled me. But I find myself reframing everything I've seen her do, every complaint, every demand, every annoying attempt at small talk, as if a victim couldn't also be a solipsist. Now I want to read everything about her more generously in order to compensate her for the indignity of becoming a character in my story, the woman with the voice, when she was already another kind of character in another story entirely. The next morning, I try to help her as best I can. I carry her bags through the Houston airport. I offer to stay with her while she waits for her wheelchair. I barely grimace when she speaks rudely to the airport staff. She's been fucking stabbed. She asks me to pre-board the plane with her and get her bag stowed above her seat. She asks if I'd help her get from Newark to the city once we arrive, if I can get her to the airport train station in New Jersey, through New Jersey Transit, then through Penn Station itself in New York, all those stairs and escalators and platforms and doorways and crowds and crowded baggage racks. I say, yes, 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 yes to all of it. She has a story and now I'm part of it. I'm swollen with virtue. I'm so swollen with virtue I can hardly believe it when the man sitting next to me on the flight wants to have a conversation. Doesn't he understand? My virtue has already found its object. I have none of it left for small talk with strangers. The woman with the voice is sitting in the front of the plane, probably making someone wish they were sitting in the back. The man next to me starts talking about driving his sister out to Texas where she was moving for work. She's a traveling nurse and they drove through an ice storm in Atlanta and I really couldn't care less. This guy is just a kid complaining about the Houston airport not having enough vending machines. I feel like his mother, as if I should offer him a snack. On the tiny monitors above us, a nature documentary plays. A baby bison is getting cornered by a pack of wolves. What will happen next? Only one thing we all know. Back home in Brooklyn, no one is waiting for me. I'm newly single and not so newly 30 and leaving lots of crumbs between my couch cushions from dinners made of crackers that don't seem like the dinners of an adult. Now this guy is talking about his tour in Iraq. He says he got used to desert skies. Oh, his life is a little different than I thought. I don't know how to ask him about the war, but I asked him anyway. I asked him about the guys he was there with. That seemed safe, possible. He shakes his head, the best crew of guys ever. Now here I am, he says, nudging his duffel bag, flying home with an army bag full of hermit crab shells. I ask how many are in there. Maybe 50, he says. He has a daughter and she has 4 pet hermit crabs. I ask if they have names. They've got so many names I can't keep track, he says. Their names are always changing. Right now there is one named Clippers and the others are Peaches. All 3 of them? Yep. Just peaches and peaches and peaches. He says they need a bottomless buffet of shells. They keep getting bigger, so they keep needing new ones. So the shells in his bag aren't hermit crab shells because they were made by hermit crabs, but because hermit crabs might someday use them? Yes, he says, that is correct. Perhaps there is profundity in this. We claim something not by making it, but by making it useful. What we squat inside of can begin to constitute us. And now he's saying something else, something about the new aquarium he's building for Clippers and the Peaches. He's using old shower doors from his construction company. He has over 20 large sheets of glass, he says, and more than 50 smaller ones. And I'm trying to run the meaning-making logic over this one too. We have the big and the small. We have more than we can use. But it doesn't yield Houston all over again. And how big will his fucking crab aquarium be anyway? An entire city block. This guy can't decide whether to be interesting or not. Like someone who is mostly late, but every once in a while, unaccountably, on time. Why would I possibly believe he owed me interest anyway? Other lives are shells I want to scavenge only when the mood strikes right, only when the shells are good enough. For now, I want to know what these crabs eat. He says they'll eat pellets, but they prefer fresh fruit. What kind of fruit? Pineapples, he says. They love pineapples. He explains they have a lot of preferences. For example, they need salt water and fresh water. What about when they live in the ocean, I ask? How do they get fresh water then? He doesn't know. He says, that's what I'm still trying to figure out. This man punctures me. I felt like his mother until he said he was a father. I think of all the fear he's known, the guilt and loss and boredom, and how I don't know any of it. His endlessness is something I receive in finite anecdotes. Big desert skies, a little girl poking crabs. Sometimes I feel I owe a stranger nothing, and then I feel I owe him everything. Because he fought and I didn't, because I dismissed him or misunderstood him, because I forgot for a moment that his life, like everyone else's, holds more than I could ever possibly see. It makes me think of that David Foster Wallace commencement speech, "This is water," the one that everyone finds inspiring except for the people who think it's unbearably trite and find it pathetic that everyone else is so inspired by it. I'm so inspired by it. Wallace talks about the tedium of standing at a supermarket checkout counter, irritated by the other people in line. How stupid, this is a quote, and cow-like and dead-eyed and non-human they seem. But, he says, you can choose to see them differently. You can regard the woman who just yelled at her kid and admit that for all you know, she might have just stayed up for 3 nights straight with a husband dying of bone cancer. Maybe she just helped your spouse get through some tangle at the DMV. Maybe the annoying woman on the bus just got stabbed by a deranged stranger on her morning jog. If you learn to pay attention, he says, then, quote, it will actually be within your experience, within your power to experience a crowded, hot, slow, consumer hell type situation as not only meaningful, but sacred, on fire with the same force that made the stars. The Newark Airport train station in the middle of a blizzard does not feel on fire with the same force that made the stars. I am helping the woman with the voice and the injured body get onto a train headed into the city. We get hot chocolate at the tiny station cafe and wait on the outdoor platform in the Jersey cold while the snow comes down. I am tired of benevolence and ready for my own apartment. She tells me it was stupid how she got hurt. It was her own fault. I'm a little bit confused. Is this a confession of privilege guilt? Guilt at her complicity in the systems that oppressed the homeless man who stabbed her? Is she going to tell me that he had a story too? Because he did. Untreated mental illness, a life spent moving from shelter to shelter. He got sentenced to 23 years in prison for the stabbing, where most likely his mental illness remains untreated still. One of his victims was a former principal dancer for the New York City Ballet, out walking with his 18-month-old son who was stabbed twice in the arm. This is the kind of story with an easy victim and an easy villain, except maybe it's not so easy. Maybe we are all the villains. Maybe that's what this woman with the voice is trying to tell me. She is also telling me she is tired of standing, though I cannot make her a chair. Anyway, she says, she was dancing down in Cabo and her knees started hurting, but she kept dancing anyway. It was Mamma Mia. How could she not keep dancing? That's how she hurt herself. She looks at me and I nod. How indeed. But inside I'm feeling robbed, like something has been stolen from me. The story in which I carried the bags of a woman recovering from a stabbing attack. Now I'm in a story about a woman who danced too hard on the Mexican Riviera. It's a story about putting bags in overhead compartments and waiting in the bitter Jersey cold, about getting to the ugliest train station in the world and weaving through its maze of underground tunnels with 3 suitcases to emerge into the grim bustle of a purgatory between Midtown and Koreatown. In a way I can't explain, I've started to feel attached to this woman, weirdly protective. It's like we've been on some kind of odyssey together, and it has less to do with the night in Houston or the blizzard in Jersey, and more to do with all her shape-shifting in my internal narrative. First, she was a tyrant, then a saint, and finally, just a tourist dancing. We part ways by the cab stand. The woman with the voice thanks me for my kindness. She'll take a taxi home. I'll take the subway to an empty apartment in Brooklyn, where I'll read the article about the stabbing again, with its eyewitness quotes. He was lurching, like very zombie-esque, you know? Something wasn't right about him. His eyes were clearly crazy. He let go of the woman and he started coming for me. In another photograph of the woman with the voice, she's being carried by a police officer. She has one hand wrapped around his neck, the other hand pressed against her own throat. She felt a stranger slash a scissor blade across her neck. I will never hear what her voice sounded like when she was crying out in broad daylight for help, when she was just a difficult New York woman asking her city to save her. This is how we make the stars, again and again, by showing up with our ordinary, difficult bodies when other ordinary, difficult bodies might need us, which is the point, the again and again of it. You never get to live the wisdom just once, rise to the occasion of otherness just once. You have to keep living this willingness to look at other lives with grace, even when your own feels like shit and you would do anything to crawl inside a different one. When you would claw one peaches out of the way, and then another, and then a third, just for a shot at some shell of respite. A 3:30 wake-up call in Houston isn't the respite shell. New Jersey public transit the day after a New Jersey Super Bowl isn't the respite shell. The blizzard is no respite shell for anyone. It makes the hurt knee throb harder. Does graciousness mean you want to help or that you don't and do it anyway? The definition of grace is that it's not deserved. It does not require a good night's sleep to give it or a flawless record to receive it. It demands no particular backstory. You thought the story kept changing, but the most important part never did. She was always just a woman in pain, sitting right in front of you. Sometimes it hurts just to stand. Sometimes a person needs help because she needs it, not because her story is compelling or noble or strange enough to earn it. And sometimes you just do what you can. It doesn't make you any better or any worse. It doesn't change you at all, except for the split second that you imagine the day when you will be the one who has to ask. Thanks. So I think we have some time left for my favorite part, for questions. I feel like I've read forever. I've taken us from daily life into the night. But yeah, I would love to hear questions about either of those pieces or about writing more generally or different kinds of nonfiction or my different jobs or my personal life or like asking about.
Why do you write nonfiction? Why that particular form?
Yeah, I think lots of ways to answer that question, but one of them is certainly that I love how many different things nonfiction can be, right? So I love that nonfiction can be personal narrative, as these two pieces were examples of. I love that nonfiction can involve engaging with other works of art, other literary texts, paintings, film, music, the way that Dan earlier was talking about the book as a kind of example of somebody who understands experience not just through what's lived, but through literature. Like nonfiction can be that also. I love that nonfiction can involve reporting and interviewing, showing up places and asking people questions. I love that it can involve sort of moving between the small scale of an individual life, your life, somebody else's life, and then like the much broader scale of, say, how has America understood addiction in the 20th century? And I think I love the ways that you don't have to kind of choose between those modes when you write, but can think about the ways that they speak to each other. And there's also just frankly like a kind of experiential relief in those multiple modes, as well as what's interesting to me sort of intellectually about how they might work together. So what's difficult about writing personal narrative is a different sort of difficult than what's difficult about spending weeks in an archive, assembling all this research material, and then figuring out what to say about it. And
both of those kinds of difficulty are different from the difficulties of showing up in a room with someone and figuring out how to interview them in order to get to the kind of like grit and grain of their story. So in working on a project like The Recovering, I found that there was something really energizing about moving between those struggles. So when I would get really sick of rummaging through my diaries, my interiority, myself 10 years ago, it felt really good to like spend some time inside John Berryman's consciousness or Jean Reese's consciousness. And when I got tired of the work of like pouring through photographs of like diary entries from somebody else's archives, it felt good to kind of go back into the visceral flesh and blood of my own memories and also kind of reconnect with like, okay, what are the questions from my own life that are taking me to these archives in the first place? Like, why do I care so much about what John Berryman wrote when he got sober? I care because I look at this diary entry from my early sobriety and I see how much I was trying to figure out how to just like get through the day without booze. And so that those sort of stakes take me back into the research parts of the work with more fervor and more urgency. So there's something about kind of moving between those modes that also feels very replenishing to me as well.
Yeah. When you're writing about a particular story, like the essay you just read, do you find yourself like recognizing while you're in the moment that you might write about it later and like trying to write down details, or do you like does it come to you more upon like reflection of like what just happened, what the past? I guess.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a little different each time. So with this particular case, I mean, I think the moment when I Googled that woman and saw that she had been stabbed, I'd like to say, and I think it's true that my first reaction was to feel horrified that had happened and she had gone through that. But then I think there was another part of me that was like, oh, maybe I'll write about this encounter, you know? And so then I think I really did get into that sort of hyper-attuned mode where I was like, what's happened? Like, what's going on in this Houston hotel? These things that had just felt sort of curious to me, like this like unrelenting way that she engaged with the people around her. And a kind of dynamic that I might not have thought I would write about, but was certainly paying attention to, like, why am I so judgmental of this woman's sense of her needs, and then how does that judgment feel so instantaneously flipped by this piece of knowledge? Like, they kind of move from just my brain taking note of things to my impulse to maybe like write some of them down. So sometimes there is a way that I'm like taking notes on experience as it's happening. But I don't live all of life sort of like verbally taking photographs like while I'm on vacation, you know. It's like, I think there's also a way that I'll end up using, if I am going back to an experience that I didn't necessarily plan on writing about, I'm often drawing on what I think of as like personal archives, right? So like I do keep diaries, and those diaries aren't entirely about like material for future writing. It's also just a way of processing experience. Or I often look through my own Gmail archives, like you kind of never know what your emails from a particular era of life are going to show you. So like something else that came up in this project, there was a period when in the course of the relationship that I read a little bit about, Dave and I were trying very hard to kind of save our relationship near the end. And I was looking through some old emails from that era because I was doing that thing that maybe some of you have experienced where I was just writing in very general, kind of abstracted terms, like we were trying hard to save our relationship, you know, and those terms, while fine for conversation, don't necessarily make for the most specific or granular, compelling writing. So I was like, how can I bring this set of feelings to life? So I was looking for specificity, which is like my holy grail in writing. I was looking for specificity by going back through some old emails, and I ended up finding, I had totally forgotten that we had been part of a CSA, like one of those farm subscription services. We were getting produce from this farm every week, and so I kept seeing all these emails like from the farm that would be like
a zucchini bread recipe or like a potato goulash, and I just remembered how I never made a single fucking one of those recipes. And that to me, then I was like, oh, right, like, I could start to remember all this like unused produce, like getting like cooling in that weird, disgusting like juice in your cooler drawer in your fridge, and then I was like, oh right, that's like maybe one way of trying to get across this space we were in, where I was like, had these hopes, these hopes for a relationship where we're like getting the farm produce and like making the zucchini bread and like making the goulash and like having this domestic life with each other, but actually the produce was just like getting moldy in the cooler drawer. So it was like, that was just like an example of the way that my Gmail archive sort of like brought me back into the folds of my life in a particular moment, even when I hadn't been writing everything down to like preserve it for the record.
Is it easier for you to write about strangers or people that you're close to?
Yeah, maybe it connects to Kate's question about different kinds of difficulty. I mean, my gut response is that it's easier to write about strangers because you don't have all the baggage of, you don't have the baggage of your own personal histories with them, and the way that, at least for me, with most people in my life, I have a set of narratives that have become very familiar to me about our relationship, what they meant to me, what I mean to them. These are our dynamics, these are our hard spots, and those narratives can start to become like kind of overly familiar, overly simplistic grooves. And so when I write about people that I'm close to, I almost always end up like kind of writing into those grooves, and then I can see, if I'm lucky, or somebody else has to point out to me in rough drafts, like, this seems like overly simple, or this kind of has like a bit of a tinny, hollow quality to the prose, like it doesn't feel rich and complicated and contradictory in the way that experience is. So then I have to like revise to get to like the messy, complicated truth underneath the easy, reductive, what I sometimes call like the cocktail party anecdote version of the truth. And so those are some of the challenges embedded in writing about people that I'm close to, or people who are in a really part of my life. With strangers, you don't have that. Like, they're sort of fresh and mysterious to you, and you're not like scraping away the crud of all of your emotional baggage. But there's also the downside that you like ultimately don't know that much about them, and so you're kind of like contending with your own ignorance, but at least your ignorance is a little bit more on the surface. Like your blindness is sometimes more invisible to you, if that makes sense, when it comes to people who are close to you. So with strangers, I think humility comes a little bit more easily, or a little bit more inevitably, rather than being this kind of like sinister, sneaky, blinders on that you might not necessarily realize. At this master class that I was teaching earlier, I actually gave this writing prompt that I'll describe as this very simple, called Letter to a Stranger, just because it relates to your question so much. And it started, so a friend of mine named Colleen Kinder started this magazine called Off Assignment, that she was a travel writer for many years, and felt like the stories that she would be able to tell when she wrote like a travel piece for the New York Times, say, she could never write about the really interesting things that had happened. She was always writing like the official version about like Irish lighthouses, or whatever, which is fine. It's like a great gig. Like, I think she felt grateful for it, but she decided she wanted to put together a magazine where people could tell sort of like the messy behind the scenes versions of the story, and one of the features in that magazine was called Letter to a Stranger, and the premise was very simple, that you just write, you think of a stranger who you cross paths with, and somehow, even if they didn't stay in your life, they stuck in your consciousness, like they somehow got into your skin, and you write to them and just see what comes up. And what I love about that prompt is almost everybody has some stranger who comes to mind, like, oh, that woman, or like that man. And I like that you might not know why they matter to you, or why you're drawn to writing about them, but you just kind of like write into that unknowing. And I think that's one of the things that feels most key about writing personal nonfiction to me, is that you write into something without quite understanding why you're writing into it, and that way you let it kind of unfold in front of you, you let it surprise you, you let it kind of be rich and
love talking about the kind of communal dimensions of work, because it does feel like a very communal process to me. And so I guess I'll say a couple things. In my own process as a writer right now, it's like a very integral part of the process that I draft almost every piece and revise it like many times. Especially if any personal essay, I would probably revise like somewhere between 8 and 10 times in sort of a major way. And there's a way that maybe that seems daunting or exhausting, but actually to me it's so liberating, because it means you can get so much wrong the first time around. Like, you don't have to get it all right. You might get different things right in different drafts. You might get you might focus on one scene in one draft or one figure, and then come back and focus on another figure, another character, in another draft. It frees you up from doing everything at once. And I often, as part of that drafting process, will build in like sending a draft of a piece to somebody else, to a friend who's a trusted reader, or to an editor. And I like that that does a couple things at once. It brings in a fresh pair of eyes and a fresh perspective, but it also means that I'm taking a little bit of time away from the draft, and it's so much easier for me to revise ambitiously and rigorously when I am not so attached to the material as I always am when I've just written it. Like, after I've just written something, I can't bear to let go of a single piece of research, because I put like days or weeks or months into that research. I have to include it all. I have to cram it all in. And the same with like my sentences. Like, if I'm proud of a sentence, no way I'm gonna cut it the next day. But like maybe in 6 months, if somebody's telling me like this piece like really went on for too long at the end, then I can start to have enough distance from the prose to like cut it where it needs to get cut. So giving my work to others is also a way of like just like getting myself out of the picture for long enough to like really revise like with a set of like my own fresh eyes, in addition to the fresh eyes of whoever read it. And yeah, I think it can work in both directions. Like, it can, sometimes I'm hearing a really necessary sort of criticism, but I also think there's a way that when you're working on a piece, you can get sick of it, and you can get so saturated with its problems and so kind of like tangled up in its problems that you just can't see a way out of the spider web of it. And it can be really nice to have somebody come in and say, this is like really interesting that like there was this prison hospital where addicts were treated in Kentucky in the 1930s. Like, I didn't know about that thing that was like half prison, half hospital. And like, you're so tangled up in like, how do I write this section about the prison hospital? Like, what needs to be there, what doesn't? That just hearing somebody be like, this is interesting, can sort of like take you back to that place where it was worth writing about in the first place. So it's not all like just getting critique. And then I guess the other thing I'll say in terms of the workshop process, which I think about more at this point in my life as a teacher than a student, although I feel very strongly that like all the things I'm wrestling with in my writing about summoning complexity to the page, about figuring out how to craft like emotional and intellectual arcs, like all of these struggles are exactly the same struggles that my students are having. Like, we're all kind of in it together. I really, it's not just like lip service. I actually just viscerally feel that every day that I teach. And I think one of the things that I tell my students about workshop, which is something I heard from my very first workshop instructor in grad school, was like, it's a great day if 20% of what you hear in workshop is useful to you. And that mattered to me to hear, because I think as like a little budding people pleaser, I've been a people pleaser my whole life, but like when I emerged from a workshop, what I wanted to do was write a piece that everybody was gonna love. I wanted to incorporate everybody's feedback and create, something that was gonna like mean it was impossible for anybody to say a critical word about it. But that's impossible. It'll never happen that way. If you're writing anything worth writing, there's always going to be somebody who hates it. And so that kind of like, at a certain point, you have to realize like the job of making art isn't to create like consensus sanctioned works that everybody says, great, I sign off on it. That's not what happens. So if you kind of let go of that, then workshop can be like, all right, people are going to say their piece, and like, it's no disrespect to somebody to say thoughtful comment. I'm not sure that's the direction I want to take this piece in, and it sort of frees you up not to have to incorporate all the feedback, although, hopefully you listen to it and rent the space. And it also frees other people up to like say what they want, and then it's okay
other feedback is not the process going wrong, it's like the process going right. That kind of normalized it for me in a really useful way.
We're pretty much at time. Greg, bring us home, Greg.
All right, I want to ask a question about your text, the forming of it. In the recovery, you have this like strange balance between micro and macro, and there like are moments where you incorporate like pop culture, really holiday, Amy Winehouse movies, and you do it in such like a fluid way that like it seems organic. When you put the text together, did you start with the idea that it was going to be dynamic in both the micro and macro sense?
Yeah, it's like such a beautiful question, and I'm glad that it felt fluent. I think I guess I started with a hope, you know, that it would feel dynamic in that way, and that both parts would feel necessary, right? Like my great fear was that it would feel like the book was performing some kind of movement between different kinds of writing, just for the sake of doing that, rather than because each strand absolutely needed to be there. So it felt really important to me that you were like learning something, not just in terms of content or information, but learning something about the experience of addiction, or trying to form a narrative about addiction, or recovery, and how recovery was simultaneously like sort of terrifying and expansive, or like the challenges of trying to write about getting better. You were like getting something from each section that you couldn't get from any other section, and I think that to me was like that feeling of each section being necessary was a really important part of how to create that sense of like dynamic movement between them. And then I also think there's something satisfying, at least to me as a reader, about moving between micro and macro, and about seeing stories, seeing truths that you can only see by juxtaposing certain things against each other. So like the story of John Berryman as this like white male poet who everybody, or not everybody, but who was sort of celebrated by the press and by his peers as this sort of self-destructive man whose self-destruction was like very related to his genius. To see that in contrast to somebody like Billie Holiday, whose self-destruction was narrated in a very different way. Like for some people, right, it was like her self-destruction was really related to her genius, but for other people, she was like a black woman who had created a crime and belonged in prison. And so there's something about telling those two stories together that felt really important to me, to say, why was one person's addiction narrated as a symptom of genius and another person's addiction narrated as a crime? Like, why do we not tell these stories in the same place, and what happens when we try to bring them into the same space? So I think there was a way that I wanted that I guess what I'm trying to say there is like the dynamic movement wasn't always just supposed to be about resonance or parallels, or like this situation is like this situation, I'm putting them together, but I actually wanted there to be friction between the storylines too, in ways that they like didn't line up, and that was kind of supposed to be troubling and uncomfortable, and I wanted that to be part of the dynamic energy too. Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslie. And I want to just quickly thank you all for coming out and for your support of our series all year. I've been really excited to be bringing wonderful poets and fiction writers and nonfiction writers to campus, and to see the passion and the enthusiasm with which you've received them has been the reason why it's worth doing for me. So I appreciate that tremendously. I want to thank Chuck and the whole IT team for all of your support all year. Thank you, back there, being the unsung heroes. And finally, with the reminder that, courtesy of the bookstore, Leslie's books are here for sale. I will be pretending to be working for the bookstore. If you want to come up and buy one of the books, or if you have your own copy, I'm sure Leslie would be happy to sign it. I've been volunteering you to do that, but I'm figuring that's cool. Thank you so much for coming, Leslie. And if you could all please join me in giving her one last round of applause.